see, Bishop Nixon. I think he was about 50 or so when that was taken. I'm not sure if it's a self-portrait because he was a photographer, but a lot of you will know that Bishop Nixon, Francis Russell Nixon, bought this house in 1850 and extended it by adding on this room to accommodate his growing family. Now, Nixon was cultured, intelligent, worldly, and looking up the literature, there's lots of descriptions of him. And I liked two of them, one extremely brief. They called him an elegant scholar. But there was another description in Nora Nixon's book on, with Anna Maria's letters. And it's by the sister of a police magistrate in Van Diemen's Land, and she writes rather enthusiastically. The bishop was a rather remarkable man, both in appearance and character. Good-looking, coal-black hair, clustering in thick curls on a round head. This is shades of George attire. Piercing black eyes and full, rather thick lips. Tenacious of his rights, extremely anxious to be correct with regard to costume and all other points of etiquette. Devoted to the fine arts and a beautiful draftsman. His sketches of the Tasmanian scenery were masterly. And some of these you'll see today, but there's more on display out in the hallway of Runnymede, and there's reproductions of other sketches on the large map in the hallway as well. Now, after his arrival, he set about what you might call firmly and energetically organising these dioceses to his and the church's satisfaction. He did come across some challenges. He clashed with the governor. There was dissent within his church, and he had a concern for the convict system, which might have led him to take up the bishopric, we don't know. So he led a very hectic and busy life, as well as all his other daily commitments, giving sermons and counselling. And he also went on his progressives around the state. Progressives. He went away a lot. He went round his diocese. He'd been to the Bass Strait Islands in 1843, soon after he arrived, and he went to Sydney actually he went back to England in 1846 to fundraise for the church and lobby for the church, and he went to Sydney in 1850 and to Norfolk Island as well, which was part of his diocese of Tasmania. So he was used to travelling. But in 1854, he expressed a wish to visit the Bass Strait Islands again, saying that he wanted to bring the church to the Bass Strait Islands. And he recorded his journey in a book, which he published in 1857. Very slim volume, Bishop of Tasmania's Visit to the Bass Straits. But the title is extraordinarily long. It's called The Cruise of the Beacon. A narrative of a visit to the islands in Bass's Straits, with illustrations. Published in London in 1857. It's only got 114 pages in it, and it's got 10 engravings of his original sketches. Now, I've put on the tables an excerpt from the first page of the book, in which he outlines why he went. And keep in mind that that book was written 3 years after the voyage, so there's a lot of thought gone into that first page. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, when I go on a holiday or I go away from home, when I come home, the only thing that people say to me was, "What was the highlight of your trip?" I mean, you must be used to that. And I think that this little book, Nixon, we can find clues of why he went. He says it's for his religious mission, but I think he had other reasons. I think with the life he led for 11 years, it was so hectic that he thought it was time to take some time out. So he says, Keep in mind also that he had 5 children at home as well, and he was really very busy. He says that it long been his desire to visit the Bass Strait Islands, not so much on account of the extent of the population by which they're inhabited, as because I was painfully aware that the few families settled therein were entirely deprived of the means of grace and ministrations with the church. So, the government possesses a schooner of about 96 tons, that's the Beacon, which is kept mainly for the purpose of visiting and supplying the lighthouses belonging to the colony and its dependencies. Recently it was determined the operation should be, for once, extended, that the port officer, Captain King, should not only inspect the lighthouses, but also visit some of the harbours along the north coast of the island, while the Surveyor General, Robert Power, might communicate with all the tenants of the Crown lands within the Straits. So it was a business trip, and in some ways it was a business trip for the Bishop. A passage was readily granted to me on application to the authorities, and on the morning of the 23rd of September 1854, I embarked on board the Beacon in company with my 2 agreeable fellow voyagers. Now, I was talking about his other reasons for going. I think that with Captain George King and Robert Power, they were both in their 60s and they were close to retirement. The Bishop was 51, he just turned 51 in 1854, and I thought he felt ready for a boy's own adventure. And to a certain extent this comes out in the book. And I think we can get insights of it, of what the enthusiasm he brought to it, the things he was interested in, and from the book these little things come out. So I'll briefly go around his voyage and I'll try and bring out some of the insights of the book, of what he got out of the journey. Okay, this is a lovely, lovely morning. Okay, left in 1854, September the 23rd at about 2:30. And by 9 o'clock, they were rounded Cape Pillar. And Cape Pillar and Tasman's Island is one of the landscapes or seascapes that he draws all the time. There's probably about 10 tiny little sketches of Cape Pillar and Tasman's Islands in collections around the state. This is just a sample of it. He loved rocks, and he says, "The accompanying sketches will serve to explain the character of this coast better than any description." So he only mentioned sketching about 3 or 4 times, and this is one of them. He was obviously very fond of rocks, and they come up again and again. They got up the east coast very quickly. They were going to Swan Island, but they couldn't land because the weather was too bad. They went on to Goose Island, and everywhere he went, he held divine service. And there was an element of nostalgia in his trip as well, because he'd gone to the Bass Strait Islands in 1843, as I said, with his friend, his dear, late and lamented friend, Sir John Franklin. And everywhere that he went, he remembered that he'd visited with Sir John Franklin, so that came up a lot. Back to Swan Island, where they held divine service. At Goose Island, he had a service where he christened a young Malay who was so pleased to be baptised, and he was named Russell in honour of the Bishop. So all along there's namings after the Bishop. Swan Island, then they went right up to the Kent's Group, which he says on the approach, the high cliffs reminded him of his very favourite island, the Isle of Capri. And I don't know if anybody here has been to the Kent's Group, I haven't. But he said, at a closer distance, we were not as impressed. So the Kent's Group, he produces, that's the Hippolyte Rocks. There's Swan Island. You can see his obsession with rocks is coming to the fore still. This is Kent's Group. Deal Island, Erith Island. There was only about 10 people on Deal Island. and Erith Island was completely uninhabited. But this section here, with the boat, was used as the frontispiece for the book. And this was folded in. Now, from Kent's group, they make it down to Settlement Point. And this is quite sad. This is, of course, the site of Wyballina, the Aborigine settlement station. And he's obviously moved by his visit here. He says, near 11 years had passed since I landed on the self-same rocks with Sir John Franklin. How changed the scene. Then the beach was covered with Aborigines who greeted their kind and loved benefactor with yells of delight, catering and gesticulating with movements more indicative of exuberant wild joy than of elegance or propriety. Now, all was still. It was painful to witness the scene of ruin in the once neat and well-ordered settlement. And this is one of his main themes in the book. It obviously had a big impact on him, his visit to the settlement, which was deserted. They'd all moved to Oyster Cove. And it's interesting that later on he goes to Oyster Cove and takes the first photographs of Aborigines ever taken in Tasmania. And he's well known for being the first photographer of Aborigines. He devotes 7 pages of the book on his reflections on the Tasmanian Aborigines, their lifestyle, their history, their contact with Europeans, and it's a very sympathetic view. He then devotes another 7 pages to the views of Dr. Milligan. Tell me when to stop. So that's 14 pages, and the book's only 114 pages, so that's more than 10%. So this is one of the abiding themes in the book, that the condition of the Aborigines and what happened to them. Gun Carriage Island, which is now Bass Island. They ran aground because they had a bad pilot. But on Gun Carriage Island, another theme of the book arrives, which comes up again and again, and it's the weather. The weather in Bass Strait. They make Mr. Tucker's hut on Gun Carriage Island. You can see Flinders Island in the background, and they made it just in time. Within a quarter of an hour of our landing, the gale had increased to a hurricane. The rain was driving against the casement. As we looked upon it from the streaming window, the sea was white with foam. The wind howled and raved through every chink and crevice of our frail tenement. He's very Victorian in his writing. I have been tolerably familiar with wild weather in the course of my many rambles. I have rarely met with such a landstorm, and the weather comes up again and again. It stopped them going straight across to King Island. They had to seek refuge in Georgetown. It stopped them returning home via the west coast. They had to come back the same way they'd come. And in virtually every spot, their anchorages were windswept. They ran aground. They had to have pilots, and the weather dominated virtually every page. Now, it wasn't all fun. At Preservation and Clark Islands, the 2 of them, the Surveyor General, Robert Power, had to issue an eviction notice to one of the tenants, or the tenant, because he'd let his brother settle on Preservation Island, where he had built a building, settled his family, and didn't pay any rent. So Robert Power had to issue an eviction notice. And then he went to Preservation Island, where the lessee, Dr. Allen, hadn't paid any rent for months, for years. So he was told, he was issued the default notice. And it's interesting that in the interim, Nixon seemed to have a lovely time. Our mission to Preservation Island was satisfactorily accomplished. The Surveyor General delivered his cartel and had his bathe. I had my quiet talk with the 2 solitary inhabitants of the place, and afterwards took a ramble and a sketch. So, maybe that was the sketch he took. Okay, I said the weather stopped them going straight across to King Island. They went to Georgetown. And it's a lovely little picture of Georgetown as it was in 1854. He stayed a while in Georgetown and he went to Launceston as well, because they had duties there. Having some stores to deliver at Launceston, Captain King decided upon taking advantage of it. A portion of our cargo consisted of 2 36-pounders, which were intended for the defence of the newly built fort. As they have neither artillerymen, nor powder, nor ball, I fear that the guns will not add much to the security of the good town of Launceston. So he couldn't resist that little comment. They stayed a while. He went back to Georgetown, but they were kept there for another week or so, and now we're looking at the 11th of October. And they were kept there until the 27th of October because of the stress of weather, the dreaded Tasmanian weather. They then went on to the Mersey. All the way along he's gathering congregations everywhere, giving divine service. Stayed at the Mersey a while because there was duties. The Surveyor General was surveying the Mersey River for moorings and buoys. Then they went to Circular Head. And that's the jetty at Circular Head, there, where he gave divine service in a new church. This is St Paul's Circular Head. And this little illustration is very different from most of what he did. He did seascapes, he did landscapes, all tiny ones. This is a building. He didn't draw many buildings. If he did, you can see by the previous one, they were very rough. But this one, he delineates the stonework really beautifully. And it's a really lovely little image. He also went to the chapel in the forest, and in the book there's an engraving of the building of the chapel in the forest, which had a school attached. And he was willing to give advice everywhere and anywhere. He gave educational advice as well. At the school, he came across a more than commonly intelligent class of children. The part of their ordinary lesson book which was placed in my hands happened to be on volcanoes. I was glad to have the opportunity of impressing the day's work upon their minds by drawing a rough sketch of Vesuvius, and by relating what I had seen of its eruptions during my many visits to it, both by day and by night, some 20 years ago. So he acted as a teacher for a little while. Okay, Circular Head, and then up to King Island. They needed a pilot, and their main mission was to go to Fitzmaurice Bay, just there, on the west coast of King Island, to look at the wreck of the Cataraqui, which had been wrecked on the morning of the 4th of August, 1845, 9 years before they were there. And the pilot, David Howie, was a local man who'd been involved in clearing up the wreck. And Nixon writes, this had a great effect on him as well. The pilot told him appalling tales of the fearful wreck of the female emigrant ship, Cataraqui. Out of the 423 souls on board, only 9 were saved. The poor unhappy girls were tossed into the ocean as they were, unclad, unprepared. There was no hope for feeble womanhood in that dark struggle with the rocks and billows for life and death. For 2 or 3 miles the shore was strewn with the bleeding corpses of the poor girls in every form of struggling agony. Now that's very high Victorian writing, and it goes on and on and on. While they're there, they killed 2 snakes, and this is another thing that comes up. He kills the wildlife. Most places he goes, he either kills a whip snake or a diamond snake, and some of them are easy to kill, some are put up a fight. But then they went up further. They cleared the graves of 245, and that was their mission, to clear the graves, make sure they were looked after and tended. That was obviously one of the duties that they intended to do. Then they went up to the New Year Islands, right up here. He says, no tongue can describe or sketch delineate the wild, savage ruggedness of this fearful coast. So he's mentioning his sketching again, and the weather wasn't very kind to them. And up on New Year Islands, they found two more wrecks. The Water Witch, which was wrecked just a few months before they were there, and then the Brahman, which was wrecked 6 months before then. And the beach was still littered with things. No one was there. There was very few survivors. But he says, on the beach we found a medicine chest, scent bottles, hair oil. The bishop loved hair oil. Hence antimacassars on the chairs. Bottles of fish sauce, Parisian stays, gutta percha shoes, parasols, cigars, a sextant and a quadrant. So his other thing that he was talking about was the wrecks. Had a huge impression upon him. Okay, the weather was so bad they couldn't come back. So in 24 hours, less than 24 hours, they came round there and they were back at Swan Island. So the wind was blowing enormously. It was a really good trip home. Okay, they left Swan Island and they come down here before. 22nd of November, they're on their way home. By 8 o'clock this morning, we rounded Swan Island, having traversed the entire length of the straits in less than 24 hours. We advanced no further than Cape Tourville by 10 o'clock at night. And that, of course, is Shooten, down here, Cape Tourville. In the morning, we were off the geographic passage that divides Shooten Island from the main. We were near enough to have a noble view of the rugged basaltic rocks. Here he is again on rocks. And we rounded Cape Pillar about 6. So Cape Pillar's down here. Very good trip down the east coast. And here we are with all sail set, our lighted our bowsprit standing quickly up Storm Bay in smooth water. Now, I've pointed out some of the things. He also commented on the wildlife, the mutton bird, the food he ate, the people he met. So I really think it was a boy's own adventure. And he says, just when he's rounding into Storm Bay, my last entry before turning into the night must be a grateful acknowledgement of the many mercies that we've seen. That's the wreck of the Katakri, and here's the New Year Islands. Sorry, I'm forgetting to show you the sketch. Shooten, Maine, this is my favourite. Beautifully done, very small sketch. And he's mad on rocks again. Okay. He's saying, before turning into the night, he's giving a grateful acknowledgement of the many mercies that we've received at the hands of divine providence during our 2 months' absence. We've seen much, done much, planned much and learnt much without a single serious discomfort or misadventure. Landed at 9:30 in the morning, 24th of November, walked over to Bishopstown and found all well at home. So the bishop settled back into his routine again and found time to write his book, which was fairly well received in the press. The Courier, the 20th of January, 1858. It was published late 1857. The bishop's narrative is enriched with 10 illustrations, 10 exquisite gems fitted into a casket worthy of them. If, as we are told, there are 10 out of only some 29 or 30 which were sent to England by the author, we trust that the remainder are not permanently lost to us. To have engraved the whole might not have suited the immediate purpose of the present publication, but there must be, or at least there ought to be, a ready means of publishing the rest. We have only to add that, considering the inability of the author to revise the press, the book is very correctly printed, and that in every respect it is well got up. Now there's a book review for you. The remaining illustrations, the remaining 29 or 30, that are referred to in that were not lost to us completely. All of the images that you've seen today, and that was only 11 of them, remain in Tasmania. Most of them are held in an issue of the book, which was obviously sent back to England, but the bishop made a special presentation copy, which he dedicated to AM, which is Anna Maria, his second wife. And he did an additional about 20 illustrations, about that size. That's a reproduction. And he tipped them in through the pages. There was also about 7 photographs as well. Some of his voyage, some of him back in Runnymede at home. And this special presentation copy was discovered in Tasmania by being taken into a person in a library who's sitting over there, Julian Winter, in about 1970, by someone who had received the presentation copy from England, from a friend of his who said, "This is about Tasmania, you might be interested." And he took it into Julian and said, "Can you find the right place that I can donate this to?" And Julian picked it for what it was, an extremely valuable, extremely precious copy, and gave it to the Allport Library, arranged for it to be donated to the Allport Library. And this is where, obviously, where the illustrations went. They went back to England, went into this presentation copy, and now it's been returned home. I couldn't bring that to show you today. I knew I didn't have a chance of getting it out of the Allport Library. It's very fragile, it's very precious, and it's not exposed to light very much. 2 of the images I showed you were from St David's Cathedral collection. They also have a lot. And Victoria Museum Art Gallery have some, and the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery have some. So all in all, we have over 50 that I know of, and that includes the book. That's it. I'm sorry I went over time. I'd just like to say thanks to the institutions who preserve the legacy of the bishop, his written words, his artworks, and to the institution that preserves his family home, this house. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marian. Marian has had an absolute ball of late organising an exhibition in the house of Bishop Nixon's pictures that we have here, that we don't display very often either because they're quite fragile. So they've come out for the month of May. So after you've had afternoon tea, do go down the hallway to the bedrooms and have a look at those very special pictures. Will be an opportunity perhaps over afternoon tea to ask any questions of both our speakers today. I'm just going to move this slightly. Now, about 4 years ago, I had a phone call here at Runnymede, and this rather lovely English voice said, "Well, look, I'm coming to Tasmania and I'd like to visit the home of my great-great-grandparents." And I said, "Oh, well, where's that?" "Oh, it's at Runnymede." And I said, "Oh, so you're a great-great-granddaughter of Bishop and Anna Marian Nixon?" And she said, "Yes, I am." So we were absolutely delighted in 2010 to have Margaret Benedict Morley visit us and spend some time here at her family's home. And again, Margaret has come out to visit us again for a couple of weeks. Margaret has been an absolute treasure to us because she has donated it to the National Trust here at Runnymede, not just a sketchbook of Bishop Nixon's that had belonged to her family, but 2 rather beautiful portraits of Bishop Nixon and Anna Maria Nixon, which are now hanging in our study. And I asked Margaret when she was coming out, I said we were doing a little talk about the journey of the bishop, and we thought it would be a lovely thing to talk about the journey of those portraits. And I'm not going to tell you where they journeyed to because it's quite an interesting journey, but I'm going to welcome Margaret to come and tell us about that journey of the portraits. Margaret.
Thank you, Deborah. speaking. Please be gentle with me. Right, I'll start off in 1843. Okay, the talk is about the travels of the Bishop and Anna Maria's portraits. They can't speak for themselves, so I'm going to sort of help them along their way. They were painted in 1843 by George Richmond in London, and he had 83 sitters that year, amongst them Gladstone and his wife. And so this is a self-portrait of the artist who drew the portraits which you now have here at Runnymede. So they would have been painted in January or February in 1843 because the Bishop and Anna Maria sailed for what was then Van Diemen's Land on the 7th of March in 1843. And they sailed on a timber-hulled merchant bark called the Duke of Roxburgh. And they had their 6 children with them. On board, their dog, a cow, a goat, a couple of clergymen, some other passengers, and a crew. So they sailed out of Plymouth, southward across the North Atlantic Ocean to Trinidad, and then from there down to Ascension Island in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The next stop was Cape Colony, and then all the way across the Indian Ocean to Van Diemen's Land, where they arrived on the 21st of July in 1843. So that trip took them from the 7th of March to the 21st of July. They arrived here, and that's a sort of an old 1950s map of Van Diemen's Land. So my next dates are 1844 to 1846. Now it is known that the bishop's portrait travelled to Van Diemen's Land on the Duke of Roxburgh because one of the well-known prints of the portrait was created by John Skinner Prout, an artist who had taken his family to live in Van Diemen's Land in 1844. And so he created a print of the original Richmond portrait. So he couldn't have done that if the portrait hadn't been in Tasmania, in Van Diemen's Land. There's no print of Anna Maria that I know of, and nowhere, or none of the scholars to whom I have spoken about my projected talk knows whether or knew if Anna Maria ever came to Van Diemen's Land. And one thought, Dr. Keith Atkins said, he thought she probably remained in England with her family. Okay. So, Bishop down in Van Diemen's Land, Anna Maria's portrait with her family. And also, in her letter home, written on the 5th of July in 1844, Anna Maria says, "We have a pleasant acquisition just now in Mr. Prout, a very talented artist from Sydney, whose first lithographic views we send you. But by these you cannot in the least judge of his original drawings, which the bishop says are the cleverest things he knows." I think. So that is the print of the bishop by Prout. And how it turned up at my home in England, it would have been, I just don't know, but I have it. So it sits there, and this is one of his sons, just so happens. More on him in a while. Okay, so February 1862, they are at sea. They're returning to England. The Nixons returned to England due to the bishop's relentless ill health. Presumably, the portrait returned with them, probably not until November that year, when Bishop Stowe, as Runnymede was then called when the bishop lived here, was sold. So
I have written here, I have absolutely no exact idea of their whereabouts in England or in Vignolo from 1862 until maybe 1873. It's not that I knew where the portraits were, but my grandfather was born in 1873. He was Willoughby Francis Nixon. So Grandad born in England, he's one of 15 children born to Bishop and Anna Maria's son, Francis William Nixon. They had 5 sons. 4 of them lost their lives during World War I. One boy died when he was very young. And Francis William Nixon and his wife, they also had 5 daughters. Amongst them, Nora Nixon, my great aunt. But great aunt Nora died in 1956, and I didn't first go to England until 1962, and great aunt Nora had passed away by then. But I did meet great aunt Cicely, great aunt Sybil, great aunt Dorothy, and great aunt Beatrix, who was a Church of England nun, a teaching order aunt, and she taught out in South Africa all her life. Let me see. Okay, that's Grandad, and his lovely second wife, Sophia Shakespeare, whom I knew as a child, both of them, and that is the bishop's son, Francis William Nixon. He was a colonel in the Royal Engineers, and he was out in South Africa at the time of the Boer War. Okay. So now this is about 1893, and this house is called Commonside, and it's in the village of Rogate in West Sussex, about 15 minutes from my front door in England today. And there's Grandad as a young boy, probably about 20 years old, his dad and mum, and 3 of his sisters, and all of them, of the 5 sisters, they were all maiden, none of them married. So it's quite an interesting little story there. And so, when is it? 1893. So that's Grandad at Commonside. Okay, so here's some more pictures. Now this is Grandad at Commonside with his dad in 1911, and I know that the Nixons were tenants of Commonside in 1911 through the Historical Society in Rogate. They gave me that little bit of information. So that we don't know whether that child is one of Grandad's sons. We think it might be my Uncle Theodore, but we're not sure. Okay, so Grandad is at Commonside, and around 1897, Grandad travels to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to work for the British Railways there. He was an engineer. So did he then have the portraits and take them up to Buenos Aires with him in 1897? I don't know. But it could have been the first time that the portraits crossed the Atlantic. Okay. And here we are. That's my cousin, my Reverend Dr. Mike Nixon, who lives in Darwin, and myself, when Mike came to England to visit in 2009, and we are at Commonside. There. Do you see a little likeness? So that's the house where they lived, and it's still standing there today. Amazingly, owned by the daughter of a girl that I was at school with in Buenos Aires. So, small world. Okay, in 1902, Grandad marries Annie Marian Miles, and she dies in 1930. That's my pioneering Grandad in Argentina. I could always remember him with a pipe in his hand, always, as I grew up. Now this is a clipping from an English newspaper in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and it's dated the 13th of April, 1905. And it talks about Grandad. It says Dr. Willoughby F. Nixon, the well-known engineer, embarked on the Onopea at Montevideo last Saturday for Punta Arenas, having been appointed superintendent, engineer, and manager for the company in Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego is that little triangle right at the very bottom of Argentina, with the Magellan Straits in the middle. Tierra del Fuego, side of the Straits, and for the carriage thence to the scene of the operations, where he will superintend the erection of the dredge. The directors of the Rio Oca Company have been fortunate in securing the services of a thoroughly competent and trustworthy engineer and manager who is used to the country, knows the language and people, and more than all is accustomed to erections and to erecting and working machinery in the wilds where there are no repair shops nor any other facilities. But so they felt that employing him, they were protecting the interests of the owners of the company, of the shareholders. So it's got nothing to do with the portraits, but it's about Grandad. And he's terribly important because he was the one that took the portraits at some point from Great Britain to Buenos Aires. Okay? Right. Oh, in 1924, Grandad's parents die, and I have visited their burial place in the cemetery in Runnymede. And two of their sons that were lost in World War I are remembered on the gravestone. It's quite beautiful. It's a slightly raised cemetery. It's quite lovely. In 1931, one of Grandad's daughters, my mother, Gladys Edith, she marries Daddy Herbert Lionel Bennett. Okay. Then, so Mummy's mother died in 1930. In 1932, yes, in 1932, Grandad remarries Sophia Shakespeare. I showed you the picture of the couple down at the bottom in that pretty ornate pink, whom we loved dearly. And they lived on Calle Brasil, opposite one of the many beautiful, beautiful, huge parks in the center of the city of Buenos Aires. Now, Sophia, whom we all called Vida, she dies in 1941. I visited their home, their flat, often. It was very big. I don't remember the portraits there. I just remember over their bed a circular frame, quite ornate, with a mother and child portrait. I used to know who it was. It was a reproduction. I still have the frame, but the mother and child aren't there anymore. There's a mirror there. Right, 1933, this lass is born, and in 1936, the Benedicts, my parents, they go to live in a suburb of Buenos Aires called Belgrano, on the street called Calle Superi, 1459. Now, Grandad marries again, and in 1944, the marriage ends disastrously, and the woman sort of kicks him out, and he's sort of homeless, Grandad. And he's not a young man, and she absconds with a lot of family memorabilia. But obviously she didn't like the portraits because they go to live at my parental home where I grew up. I figure around 1945 that was, okay? Now, I'm not sure what on earth has this got to do with the portrait? Well, this is the dining room at my home in Buenos Aires where I grew up. And that's the dining room table. And that's the sideboard that was always there behind the dining room table. And I sat at that table pretty much where I am now, probably where the fellow is, sort of to Mummy's left. Mum was at that. And behind me, guess who hung? You can just see This is the bishop's frame. Look. And that's Anna Maria's. And I've spoken to all the relatives that have been to the house through the years. Nobody has a photograph of the portrait. Over the fireplace there was an inset with lovely Delft blue and white tiles. We've got quite a few photographs of that with people standing in front of them, but nothing of the bishop, but just the frames. Now if you just try and remember the edge of that frame. But okay, so where are we now? Let's see. Right, so they're at home in Buenos Aires, and there's that picture. And so this is my home. That's Daddy with my daughters, Catherine, the younger one, and Carolyn, and the dogs, outside the front door of the house where the bishop and Anna Maria were living, in the dining room. And that is the same house in 2010. When did I go to the Falklands? After coming here, 2011. But so this is my home, but it used to look like that. You see, obviously these two properties were bought and were converted and modernized, but my home used to be this one here in the middle, and it looked like that. It did sit back from the road. It sat further back from the road than this one, because you see the other front door is there, and it was lovely. It was leaded glass, bubbly glass. I remember it sort of rattled a little bit when you opened it. So that's where the street where they lived. Then, yeah. So now, 1970. And Daddy dies, and the family home is sold. And Mummy moves to a flat in Belgrano, in the same suburb. And so that's the entrance to the flat. But the bishop and Anna Maria are relegated to the basement. It was a 3-bedroom flat, big, it's still there. My brother and his family lived there. And there's a big living room, dining room, but for some reason, Bishop and Anna Maria. Yeah. And it flooded. Oh. And so if you look at the portraits now, you will see, I mean, what's quite salient to me, there's a blemish on one of Anna Maria's cheeks, and there are things, I mean, they've been restored quite a lot here. But, so they were damaged, right. Then that was 1970 when Mummy moved there, and she died in 1975, and I inherited the portraits. So I went down to see Mummy. I knew she was very unwell, and I stayed until after she was buried and inherited the portraits. And I was living in England. So, I mean, and these great big portraits, and I'm flying back, you know, my kids, girls are there. So I asked my matron of honour at my wedding, Rosalind Spalding, if she would look after the portraits for me, because she had a big home. Yes, of course she would, so she did. So that's 1975, I think. Oh yeah, I have to pause. Okay, pictures. So now in 1980, I'm living in England, and I'm working for Lord Patrick Beresford. And Don Patricio, as I called him, irreverently, rather than Lord Patrick, as everybody else did. Don Patricio was going down to Buenos Aires to buy polo ponies for the Sultan of Pahang, Malaysia. So what has this got to do with the portrait? So I said to Don Patricio, these two big pictures of my family, do you think you could bring them up somehow? Oh, of course, Mrs. Ward would be delighted to bring them up. Just a lovely request. And so off he goes, and I stay behind running his home and running the stallion that they were syndicating. And so that's 1980. Have I lived in here? Yep. So Lord Patrick's home was in Wicks Green in Berkshire. Before coming here, and once I knew that I had to have do a little chat for Gemma and her friends, I called on Patricio and I said to him, would you by any chance have a photograph of polo ponies with their blankets on them? Oh, I'm sure I could do one for you, Mrs. Fawley. You'll be delighted. Next day, in the post. Ta-da! My beloved Lord Patrick sends a selfie